Welcome back to The Explainer. So when you picture ancient Egypt, I'm guessing your mind goes straight to the big stuff, right? The towering pyramids, the gold-covered pharaohs, those massive sweeping temples. But today we're doing a total cinematic zoom in. We're going to drop right past those grand monuments and dive straight into the gritty, fascinating, and honestly highly structured reality of everyday citizens during the New Kingdom. So we're talking roughly 1570 to 1069 BCE.
It's a pretty simple question when you think about it. What was life actually like if you weren't, a pharaoh? We've all kind of got this preconception of this ancient, slave-driven society where everyone was just endlessly hauling giant stones under a blazing sun. But looking at the archaeological records, the reality was a remarkably relatable daily grind. These were people who stressed over their paychecks, gossiped with their neighbors, and literally just tried to keep their houses cool in the summer.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our flight path for today's explainer. We're covering the pursuit of Ma'at, the homes of Deir el-Medina, bread, beer, and wages, women's rights and roles, and wrapping up with fashion, faith, and daily life. We'll start at the very top of their societal order to see how their world worked, and then zoom all the way down into the living rooms, kitchens, and even the makeup bags of ancient workers.
All right, Section 1. The Pursuit of Ma'at, Society's Grand Design. To really get what everyday life was like, we first have to take a macro view of New Kingdom Egypt, because the whole foundation of everyday existence was built on this super rigid social hierarchy.
Everyone knew exactly where they stood, and it was all driven by this one overriding cosmic principle called Ma'at. Think of Ma'at as the ultimate top-down directive. It was the universal order of truth, harmony, and balance. It started way up with the gods, flowed directly down to the pharaoh, who absolutely had to uphold it, and then trickled down to the scribes, priests, and finally the craftsmen and farmers. Basically, everyone's daily labor was just a gear turning in this massive machine of universal order.
Moving right along to Section 2, Homes of Deir el-Medina, Life in a Planned Village. So, stepping down from that huge abstract concept of the universe, let's look at a very specific, deliberately built community. This is the workmen's village of Deir el-Medina, over on the West Bank at Thebes, home to the highly skilled royal tomb builders of the Valley of the Kings. Now, what's really fascinating about this top-down plan is how highly standardized and tightly packed the village streets are. You can literally see these rectangular mudbrick structures just squeezed right up against each other. The whole village was confined by a surrounding wall, meaning neighbors lived incredibly close. And because of that proximity, cooperation, shared obligations, and, oh yeah, neighborhood gossip and quarrels were a huge part of everyday life.
If we drop right down to street level and actually walk inside one of these houses, you'll see they almost all shared this standard 4-room layout. Right in the front room, you'd usually find an elevated bed or platform, enclosed by thin walls, which was specifically used for childbirth rituals and celebrating fertility. Then you'd walk into the middle room, the main living space, which usually had a central column holding up the roof, a cooking hearth, and a low seating dais. The rear rooms were just for sleeping and storage.
Just imagine the sensory experience of the stifling Egyptian heat for a second. Without modern AC, how did they cope? Well, these homes were actually brilliant examples of ancient air conditioning. The mud bricks were made of clay, pebbles, and straw, and then painted white to bounce off the sun's harsh glare. They used their flat roofs as extra workspaces to catch the evening breeze and hung mats over the windows, kept the blazing sun and the bugs out, but let the air flow right through.
Which brings us to Section 3, Bread, Beer, and Wages, an Ancient Economy. Let's look at the money. These were highly skilled artisans, but what did they actually take home at the end of a long, brutal day of carving tombs for pharaohs?
If we compare modern currency, cash, direct deposit, with New Kingdom currency, it is a whole different ballgame. The absolute foundation of the ancient economy was grain directly from the pharaoh's granaries. Grain was distributed as your wage. The workers' families would take it home, crush it into flour using a heavy handstone on a primitive saddle corn, and bake it into bread. So bread and beer weren't just your dinner, they were literally your paycheck.
And speaking of beer, get a load of this number, 1 1/3 gallons. That is literally over 10 pints. That was the massive daily beer ration handed out to these laborers and tomb builders. Sounds like a total party, right? But the reality was actually completely practical.
See, this wasn't modern recreational drinking. Ancient beer was this thick, fast-fermenting, incredibly calorie-dense liquid food. Those calories were absolutely essential to give laborers the energy they needed for that grueling work. And get this, the Ebers Papyrus, which is an ancient Egyptian medical text, shows that beer was heavily used in medicine. It acted as a bacteriologically clean carrier for other medicinal ingredients. They were brewing this continuously, in massive volumes, without a single modern thermometer.
All right, shifting gears to Section 4, Women's Rights and Roles, Power in the Household. When we focus on the individuals actually managing these households, it is super fascinating to see that women in New Kingdom Egypt held a surprisingly robust standing in society. And this stunning gold and lapis lazuli ring brilliantly illustrates that exact point. This belonged to Queen Taweret. She wielded immense political power and actually assumed the role of pharaoh herself after the death of her husband and his heir. Now, obviously, that kind of female agency existed at the royal level, but the amazing thing is it cascaded all the way down to everyday women in villages like Deir el-Medina.
We really need to bust this myth of a purely oppressive ancient world for women. Theoretically, everyday women were equal under the law. They could own property entirely independently, enter into business contracts, initiate court cases, get a divorce, and trade textiles they made themselves for profit. There is this amazing surviving letter from a villager named Butataman to his deceased wife, literally praising her for how well she independently managed their cattle. They were formidable partners.
Finally, we are down to Section 5, Fashion, Faith, and Daily Life, Intimate Details. Let's look at the most intimate level of this explainer, the personal belongings, the clothes, and the household beliefs that shaped their daily routines.
So what were they actually wearing? Well, mostly linen. It was practical, super breathable for the dry climate, but creating it, intensely laborious. First, workers had to pull flax plants up by the roots just to maximize the fiber length. Then they soaked them, a process called retting, to loosen those fibers up. Next, they beat and combed out the strands and finally spun and wove them on horizontal looms. A massive undertaking just to make the everyday kilts and dresses they walked around in.
And you literally can't talk about ancient Egypt without mentioning kohl. We all know that iconic dark eyeliner, but let's bust another myth here. This was not just about fashion. For both men and women, kohl was the ultimate ancient multitasker. It actually acted as protective sunglasses to cut the harsh glare of the desert sun. Plus, the cosmetics and scented oils they used helped moisturize and protect their skin from that punishing, dry climate. So beauty and survival were essentially the exact same thing.
Before we wrap up, you've got to meet the protectors of the house. While Ma'at was out there governing the whole universe, everyday household faith relied on these guys. On the left, we have Taweret, the fierce protector of mothers, rocking a pregnant hippo's body, a crocodile's back, and a lion's paws. Incredible, right? And on the right is Bes, the dwarf-like god of fun and games, who's almost always shown sticking his tongue out. They were these fiercely protective, comforting presences kept in the front room of pretty much every single home.
So, bringing it all together, I want to leave you with a final thought to close out this explainer. When you strip away the 3,000 years of history, the giant temples, the golden pharaohs, you are just left with people. People who chased a daily paycheck of bread and beer, innovated ways to keep the house cool, sought legal protections, and decorated their living rooms with things that made them feel safe. Honestly, how different are we really from the villagers of Deir el-Medina? Human nature is totally timeless. Thanks so much for joining me, and I hope this sparks you to dig even deeper into the history.